In this video, I'm going to talk about steps in the risk management process. This is from Chapter 3 of the RiskMgmt text. I like this quote from John A. Shedd saying, "A ship in harbor is safe, but that is not what ships are built for." It's a good representation of how important it is that we take risks in life, whether it's driving a car, starting a business, having a family. All of these things involve taking risks, but they're worth taking as long as we manage the risk appropriately. The risk management process is a step-by-step process. So in this video, I'm going to go through all of the steps of risk management. The first step of risk management is to determine your objectives. You should always start every process, project, or endeavor by first identifying your objectives, whether or not it's going to school or when you're studying for a test and what you want to accomplish. You need to identify your objectives in order to appropriately determine the steps to reach those objectives. But the overall purpose of risk management is to help an organization achieve its goals and not to be blocked by losses from risk, especially pure risk. Years ago, the focus of risk management was only on pure risk. These days, as I mentioned in the first lecture, there's a focus on enterprise risk management, which says that it's better to actually consider both speculative and pure risk in risk decisions. And I think that's been proven time and time again. Objectives can be classified as either pre-loss or post-loss. Pre-loss objectives include financial strategy or economics. This means that every risk management decision must include a cost-benefit analysis. But before you even begin your risk management process, you need to know where your organization, or you as an individual or family stand financially. Second, your attitude toward risk. This also has to be established before you begin a risk management process. Some people are very risk aggressive and others are very risk conservative. And in fact, some things you might be risk conservative in, such as maybe in how you manage your money, but other things you might be a little more aggressive. So you need to be able to realize an appropriate reduction of anxiety. And this is going to be different for different people. Some people thrive more under situations of risk. Stockbrokers and sales professionals often don't have a hard time taking a lot of risks, whereas some people, like maybe accountants or physicians, might be less likely to take risks. Legal obligations also has to be a consideration every time. You must consider compliance with laws and statutes, both at the federal, state, and local level. Now let's look at post-loss objectives. For an organization or individual, the first thing that you have to consider after a loss has occurred is how are we going to survive? So you need to take steps to make sure, first and foremost, that the organization remains a going concern. Second, continuity. You want to make sure not only that the organization survives after a loss, but can continue basically at the same level that it was at prior to the loss. So if a business, such as a bank, wants to continue after a hurricane, they might want to have an alternate location from which to operate and see clients, or at least to have an IT system set up in the event the hurricane wipes away their existing system. Earning stability, which is related to continuity. You want to make sure that a loss doesn't dramatically affect your company's, or if it's an individual or family, your family earnings. And growth. You want to make sure that losses from pure risk and other types of risk don't impede the organizational growth. And switching gears a little bit, social responsibility, which some consider more of a pre-loss goal, but it's listed as a post-loss goal in your text. Social responsibility includes things like making decisions about how to handle crises, such as the BP oil spill. Recalling products that might be dangerous. This is always a difficult decision for an organization because the cost to recall products is very expensive. Recently, there was a recall of Bluebell ice cream, and even though it only impacted certain flavors of Bluebell, the company recalled the entire line of ice cream. And quite often, auto manufacturers have to recall a car. Again, even though it might just be a few of the cars that have a problem, and it's quite costly to recall cars, when you do a cost-benefit analysis, it's better to recall the cars. Also, it dramatically affects an organization's reputation when they fail to recall cars or anything like a child, like a car seat or ice cream, and someone is injured. So the long-term loss might be more than just the legal liability they incur because of injury. It might be a severe reputation impact which causes their product to be much less popular. Next, identifying your loss exposures. To identify your loss exposures, one of the best ways of identifying your loss exposures is to first consider the categories of exposures, and there are three: property, liability, and human resource or personnel. First, property exposures. The exposure to loss with property is both loss of value of the property, in other words, if the property is damaged and you have to replace it or you can no longer sell it, and loss of use. This includes not being able to use your car because it's been damaged in an accident, or maybe not being able to live in your home because it's uninhabitable because of a fire or windstorm. For a business, it also includes net income. When you're not able to use your business or continue operating, you lose net income. The next category is liability. This is damage awards, such as bodily injury or property damage. This is third-party losses because you're legally liable to somebody else for your own actions, usually because of your negligence or an organization's negligence. It may include professional liability as well, such as you give bad advice to a client and the client loses money because of your bad advice. You might be professionally liable for their damages. And then it also includes defense cost. Most of the time, insurance pays for the defense cost in order to defend their insured when they've been sued. And these defense costs can be quite substantial. Next, there's personal, personnel, or sometimes called human resource losses. These include benefits such as healthcare and retirement. For individuals, this would be healthcare and life, and the exposure of the death of a loved one, and workers' compensation for an organization. In addition to just thinking about the categories of exposure that you have, there are also certain identification tools. First, physical inspection. This is literally someone walking around the premises of a business or organization or building and checking out where risks might exist. Next, a survey form. Oftentimes, these are done by insurance companies to help you identify common risks for a certain industry or type of organization. This page is an excerpt from a survey that we do in RiskMgmt 3008, which is business risk management. Notice especially this question here: which of the following is used or done as a critical part of running this business? Just identifying all of these things as critical parts of running the business mean that they should be a focus of risk management. Next, a flow chart. If the organization has a flow chart or access to a flow chart, this can be extremely helpful because as you go through the flow chart, you see how the organization operates, and it especially helps to identify potential bottlenecks, like here where the organization sends its monthly forecast of need to suppliers, and the suppliers have to transport the supplies to the organization. If for some reason the supplier is unable to deliver those supplies, that could be a bottleneck, meaning a point where everything comes together, and if it's stopped, it stops the procedure and the entire operation to a halt. So those are also important points of risk management focus. Additionally, financial statement analysis can be very useful at identifying risks and risk exposures. For example, this might be an organization's balance sheet. Particularly important are these two things: property, plant, and equipment. This lists the values of property, plant, and equipment, but just remember that the book value, which is what's shown here, is not necessarily the market value or the replacement cost of property, plant, and equipment, but it does give the organization some idea of how much they have in value that they need to protect. The surplus amount is another important number because it tells the organization what kind of cushion they have, which in this case they have a substantial cushion compared to their property, plants, and equipment, which means that they might be able to retain more risk than another organization that doesn't have as much surplus. Other things to look at to help identify risks are past loss experience. While history doesn't always repeat itself, past losses can often be great indicators of future losses. Additionally, it's important to know that near misses or almost losses should be tracked as well, because oftentimes minor accidents can become major ones. Also, other company reports, like reports from purchasing, obviously, which are an indication of values, property values, HR, which are an indication of employees and benefits, and accident reports. Additionally, some organizations, especially larger ones, have a risk management information system, which is simply an information system that has data, usually on past losses and other important reports. With the risk management information system, if it's accessible to the entire organization, this can be very useful in determining how much insurance to buy, how much risk to retain, and where loss control efforts need to be focused. And talking to experts. I couldn't resist this one. But really, I mean people like lawyers, accountants, maybe engineers, and technology specialists about your risk exposures like cybersecurity or architectural risks. An organization that has a risk manager still needs to rely on people who are experts in their field to truly understand the risks and how to manage them. The third step of risk management is to measure and analyze the loss exposure. This is sometimes the most difficult step because it does involve some statistical analysis to do it right, especially for a larger organization. We'll be fairly simplistic in our discussion of how to measure and analyze loss exposures, but this can get very detailed and very quantitative. However, the terms that we're going to discuss here are basic tools that are used in any measurement and analysis approach. You should always consider frequency and severity of risks. We've already talked about the difference between frequency and severity, but there are two important measures where frequency and severity overlap. They are maximum probable and possible loss. The maximum probable loss is the loss level we can be X% certain that our loss will not exceed. I'll give you an example in a moment, but let me just say that the maximum possible loss can be very difficult, if not impossible, to determine. The maximum possible loss in terms of property is just the total value of your property. However, there are some things that can't be measured, like intellectual property or information, and while those are considered property, to value those accurately is very difficult. Liability is even harder to measure because liability could be even more than your total assets. For example, as an individual, you could lose everything that you have plus your future wages. But let's go back to maximum probable loss. Again, I said that maximum probable loss is the loss level we can be X% certain our loss will not exceed. The X depends on how conservative we are. So, to explain this, let me give you a couple of examples. If we focus on this frequency, a 99% probability that the loss won't exceed, then we move to severity, $20 million in severity, we're being very conservative. In other words, if we're an organization and we're looking at the maximum probable loss and that number comes out to be $20 million, if that's the number we focus on, we're being pretty conservative because we picked the 99% level of certainty. However, if we focus on the 90% probability that the loss won't exceed a certain point, we're being less conservative. So we might look at 15 million in severity. This number is going to be lower because we're not as certain that the loss will not exceed that number. So we're being less conservative. One example of this approach is that if we're being less conservative, we might buy insurance limits at $15 million, just being 90% certain that our losses won't exceed 15 million. We're okay with that 10% uncertainty. But if we want to be more conservative, we might insure to $20 million. The next step to risk management is to select the appropriate risk treatment technique. So what are my choices for treating risk? They are to avoid, retain, control, or transfer. Let's look at these individually. First, avoid. To avoid a risk means to never acquire the exposure or to never enter into the activity causing the exposure. You might also abandon the activity or exposure, but with that, there might still be some residual risk. For example, you might decide that some land that you've purchased was a good idea, but later realize that there was toxic waste beneath the surface. You might abandon that land. But if later someone does build on the property who buys it from you, you actually might be liable for at one time having owned that land, especially if you contributed to the toxic waste. Avoid sometimes might be confused with the prevent approach to managing risk. Look at this example. So when I asked if I should make a left and you said right, you meant as in correct. So how would you avoid this? Well, the truth is, the only way to actually avoid a car accident is to never drive. Maybe he could have prevented the accident by listening more carefully to his friend, or his friend could have prevented the accident by being more clear. They also could have prevented the accident by not driving near a cliff. But again, that wouldn't be avoidance. This is going to be important when you write your papers about a risk treatment method. In reality, avoidance is an extreme form of risk treatment and often is not appropriate. Remember, a ship in harbor is safe, but that's not what ships are built for. In life, we purposely take risks. If we're going into business, or we're just getting out of bed in the morning and going to work, or going to school, we're taking risks. So avoidance really isn't the most appropriate method most of the time, unless the risk is extreme. So now let's look at the opposite extreme, retain. Retain just means accepting the loss. Retention can be funded or unfunded. Funded means setting aside money to pay for a loss, whereas unfunded means just paying for losses out of cash flows as they happen. I sometimes equate this to the emergency fund that maybe you have. Maybe you keep $500 in your bank account just to make sure that in case something goes wrong, like your car needs repairing, you have that money to access. Retention is appropriate when losses are very small or very predictable. We'll actually look at this a little bit more when we talk about insurance, because losses that are very predictable should be retained and not insured. But why might someone retain when it's not appropriate? Well, they might do so because they don't know about the risk. They don't even know about the exposure. Or they might think that insurance is too expensive. Or they might just underestimate the chance of loss or the potential size of loss and its impact on their organization. Next, we'll talk about control. Control is loss reduction or loss prevention. Let's look at these separately, because while they both fall under control, they are different. Loss reduction is taking steps to mitigate or reduce the severity of loss. So an airbag is a good example of this, usually placed in a car. The reason it's loss reduction is when an airbag is triggered, that means that the accident has already occurred and there's likely to already be some damage. So it reduces the severity, but not the frequency of losses. Other examples? Seatbelts, because again, a seatbelt would tend not to reduce the frequency of loss or probability, but the size of a loss, because while the driver or passenger is not projected from the car during a bad accident, they might experience broken ribs or some other type of loss. And fire extinguishers. Fire extinguishers are normally only used after a fire starts, so presumably, even if the damage is minor, there is some damage after a fire extinguisher has been used. Loss prevention, on the other hand. This is taking steps to reduce the frequency of loss. So, for example, a burglar alarm or a dog. The idea being that if you have a burglar alarm or a dog, that a thief won't even come into your house and steal. Another example is wearing safety goggles to keep particles and other hazardous materials out of someone's eyes when they're working on construction. Some things can actually be both, such as fixing your brakes, making sure that they're tight. This could prevent a loss, but it also could reduce the severity of an accident if it occurs. Now let's look at transfer. Insurance is the most common example of transfer, but there are other examples. Another one is surety bonding, which we'll talk about later in the semester. Transfer is best when losses are high severity, low frequency. Why? Because expected loss is frequency times severity. What happens if the frequency or probability of loss is high, such as 60%? Well, 60% or 0.6 times 10,000, which might be the severity of loss, is 6,000. So if we're the insurance company, where do we start charging a premium? We would charge $6,000 for a $10,000 loss. This isn't something that anyone in their right mind would pay, because $6,000 would not be the total premium. It would be $6,000 plus a certain commission, underwriting cost, overhead costs, taxes, etc. So as I mentioned before, high frequency losses do not make sense for insurance. And if a loss is low severity and low frequency, even those are probably better retained and controlled. The best insurance buys: low frequency, high severity risks, such as liability risks and the exposure to death. The last step in the risk management process is implement and monitor the program and make necessary adjustments. What I really want to point out about this is that it's not just a step-by-step process that stops when you reach the top. It's an iterative process, meaning you continue to go through the steps over and over again, like this cycle. So you've implemented and monitored the program, and you make necessary adjustments as you go. And so you reassess your objectives. Then you identify any new or changing loss exposures. For most families and organizations, things are constantly changing. You might buy a new piece of equipment, you might acquire new employees, and therefore you have new risks to control. Plus, the environment around you is changing. And you reanalyze and categorize your loss exposures. And then again, you select the most appropriate treatment technique. And you go back and implement and monitor the program and make necessary adjustments. Maybe the program that you chose hasn't worked so well. So you might make adjustments because your risks have changed, or you might make adjustments because your risk management approach didn't turn out as you expected. And that's the end of our discussion of steps in the risk management process.